Hello, everybody. This is Mike History 2, and today I'll be talking about the history of Australia Part 2. So, on January 19th, 1790, the Second Fleet of 6 ships, also carrying prisoners, left England to go to Sydney. The convict transports were the Lady Juliana, the HMS Guardian, the Surprise, the Neptune, and the Scarborough, accompanied by one storeship, the Justinian. However, this fleet was not as successful as the first fleet. The Lady Juliana sailed before the other ships, and the Justinian and the HMS Guardian also left early, but the latter hit an iceberg after leaving the Cape of Good Hope and was wrecked on the coast when it returned there. Therefore, only the Surprise, Neptune, and Scarborough left together, with 1,006 convicts, out of whom 928 were men and 78 were women. The mortality rate on the Second Fleet was the highest in the history of penal transportation to Australia. 273, or 26% of the prisoners died, and 486, or 47%, got sick, meaning that around a quarter died and half of them got sick. This was because the convicts were purposefully starved, kept in chains, usually refused access to deck, had lice, and were half naked. To make it worse, 124 died shortly after arrival in late June. On December 9th, 1790, Pemulwuy's War began when a shooting party led by Arthur Phillip left for Botany Bay, but they were encountered by 2 Bidjigal men, approaching them with spears. Phillip's gamekeeper John McIntyre talked to them, but while that happened, a man called Pemulwuy ambushed and speared him. Obviously, Phillip ordered an expedition led by Lieutenant General Watkin Tench against them on December 14th, along with another 48 men, but after searching for 3 days, they returned to Sydney. The third fleet of 11 ships, also carrying prisoners, left the British Isles in early 1791, also to go to Sydney. It consisted of the Marianne, the HMS Gordon, the Matilda, the Atlantic, the HMS Salamander, the William and Anne, the Active, the Queen, the HMS Albemarle, the Britannia, and the Admiral Barrington, which combined transported over 2,000 convicts. The Atlantic, the HMS Salamander, and the William and Anne left Plymouth. The HMS Albemarle, the Active, the Admiral Barrington, the Britannia, and the Matilda left Portsmouth, and the Queen left Cork. The first ship, the Marianne, reached Sydney on June 9th, 1791, while the last one, the Admiral Barrington, arrived on October 16th. After this, ships began to arrive more regularly and trade began. In 1793, the first free immigrants arrived on January 16th. Thomas Rose, Frederick Meredith, Thomas Webb, Joseph Webb, Edward Powell, and their families. 5 years later, George Bass and John Flinders became the first Europeans to circumnavigate Van Diemen's Land, proving that it was an island. After this, about one-third of the prisoners were Irish, with their sentences usually being 7 or 14 years of penal labor. Life for these prisoners were hard, and those with trades were given tasks to fit their skills, while the unskilled were assigned to work gangs to build roads, buildings, and do other similar projects. Some were also assigned to free settlers. Those who disobeyed orders were whipped, put in stricter confinement, or sent to an even stricter prisoner colony, but after their sentences they could become free. Now, Pemulwuy's War was still going on, and starting in 1792, Pemulwuy led raids on Parramatta, Georges River, Prospect, Toongabbie, Brickfield, and Hawkesbury River, where usually killed livestock and burnt crops. 1794, the Hawkesbury and Nepean Wars began when British started farming around the Hawkesbury River. In December 1795, Pemulwuy attacked a work party at Sydney, but one of the bushrangers, an African called Black Caesar, cracked his skull. This ended the fighting, except it didn't, and 2 years later the war restarted. On March 20th, 1797, Pemulwuy led a group of Bidjigal warriors in an attack on a farm at Toongabbie. The next day, the 100 Bidjigals faced British soldiers at Parramatta, who killed 32 of them and captured Pemulwuy while having 13 of their soldiers wounded. He had been shot 7 times, but still survived, however. After recovering, he escaped with his leg cuffs still on. On November 22nd, 1801, Philip Gidley King ordered Pemulwuy to be brought to him, dead or alive. He was finally killed on June 2nd, 1802, by sailor and explorer Henry Hacking. In 1800, Napoleon, the first consul of France, ordered the Baudin expedition to explore Australia. The Géographe and the Naturaliste left Le Havre in France on October 9th, 1800, led by Nicolas Baudin, a French explorer, cartographer, naturalist, and hydrographer, and accompanied by 9 others. They reached Australia in May 1801 and sailed north, mapping the northwestern coast before sailing back south, and then east along the southern coast of the island, reaching Van Diemen's Land on January 13th, 1802, whose eastern coast they mapped. In late 1802, they went to Sydney to resupply before sailing on to the south and the west coast of the island, before finally leaving on July 7, 1803, to return to France. They arrived in Mauritius on September 16th, finally, only for Baudin to die of tuberculosis. On July 22, 1802, Matthew Flinders, a British navigator and cartographer, left Sydney on the HMS Investigator with Robert Brown, Ferdinand Bauer, William Westall, Peter Good, John Allen, and John Crossley to chart the coastline of Australia. Shortly after he encountered Baudin's expedition, what they decided to name Encounter Bay, and even though their countries were at war, the encounter was peaceful. When he eventually returned on June 9, 1803, he became the first person to circumnavigate the entire island. However, even though their encounter was peaceful, the British suspected that Baudin's real goal was to colonize Australia. This wasn't entirely wrong, since Baudin had written instructions to Napoleon on how to capture Sydney. Therefore, on August 31, 1803, the HMS Calcutta and the Ocean, led by David Collins, carrying 402 people, again mostly prisoners, landed at Fort Phillip and founded a settlement there on October 10th. After arriving there, he sent Captain James Hingston Tuckey, a British explorer, to explore it. However, both men were dissatisfied, and after asking the governor of New South Wales, Philip Gidley King, if they could move it. After approval, they went instead to the Derwent River on Van Diemen's Land and established the town of Hobart in February 1804 with 260 people, of which 178 were prisoners, making it the first settlement in Van Diemen's Land. However, barely after their arrival, fighting broke out between the settlers and the Aboriginal Tasmanians, and on May 3rd in Risdon, armed soldiers fired on around 100 Aboriginals after an encounter on a farm, killing between 5 and 50. Also that year, Matthew Flinders left to return to England on the HMS Porpoise. It stopped in Mauritius with Flinders thinking that he would be safe because he was on a scientific journey, but since the United Kingdom was at war with France in the War of the Third Coalition, he was imprisoned for 6 years. There, the first full map of Australia's coast was published as the Freycinet map of 1811, with combined information from Baudin and Flinders' expeditions and drawn by Louis de Freycinet. Flinders himself also published a map of Australia in 1814, simply called Australia, and then wrote his account of the voyage in A Voyage to Terra Australis. In 1801, though, land exploration also began with the British explorer, soldier, and botanist Colonel William Paterson leading an expedition to explore the Hunter region and go up the Paterson River. In 1804, he also led an expedition to explore Van Diemen's Land by going to Port Dalrymple and then going up the Tamar and North Esk rivers. Now, I've mentioned for a long time how many prisoners were in Australia, and with such an enormous prison population, it's kind of inevitable that rebellions would break out. Many convicts in Castle Hill had been imprisoned for their involvement in the Irish Rebellion of 1798. One veteran, Philip Cunningham and William Johnston, another Irish prisoner, planned a rebellion with over 685 prisoners and planned to meet another 1,100 prisoners in the Hawkesbury River area, join together at Constitution Hill and march on Parramatta and then Sydney in order to establish Irish rule and obtain ships for those who wanted to return to Ireland to revive the failed Irish Rebellion of 1803. On March 4th, 1804, he burned his hut as a signal for the beginning of the rebellion, but it was not seen by the prisoners at Green Hills on the Hawkesbury River. Cunningham led 200 to 300 prisoners and seized firearms, ammunition, and other supplies at the government farm. On their way to Parramatta, they seized more weapons and supplies. When news of the rebellion spread, the 5,000 inhabitants of New South Wales started to panic. But in Sydney, Philip Gidley King led a contingent of 56 soldiers and marched to Parramatta to stop them. George Johnston, with 30 soldiers and 67 militiamen, faced the 233 rebels the next day at Rouse Hill Estate and called upon them to surrender, but received the reply, liberty or death. The battle began, and as the British fired, 15 died before they surrendered, with no British person dying. 9 people, including the leaders Cunningham and Johnston, were executed. 2 people were imprisoned, 7 were whipped with 200 or 500 lashes and sent to the Coal River chain gang, while 23 others were sent to the Newcastle coal mines and 34 prisoners were placed in irons. The rest were either sent to Norfolk Island or pardoned. And this was the first rebellion in Australian history. However, if you thought the fighting ended there, you are wrong, because in 1806 more fighting broke out in Van Diemen's Land as several tribes attacked the British, sparked by competition for game. The arrival of 600 more British from Norfolk Island between 1807 and 1813 caused more tension after they settled 10% of Van Diemen's Land around Launceston. They attacked Aboriginal camps at night, slaughtering their parents and abducting their children as servants. In 1816, the Hawkesbury and Nepean wars ended after raids and skirmishes from both sides killed at least 80 Darugs, Eoras, Tharawals, and Gadangaras, and at least 300 British died, but they had successfully taken over the region. Meanwhile, in Van Diemen's Land, by 1820, there had been at least 57 Aboriginal attacks on the British, and probably even more British attacks. But after this, the violence became much worse, as the British attacked the Aboriginal Tasmanians for sport, women, children, and conquest. This was made worse by the fact that men outnumbered women 6-1 among the British. In January 1824, the Bathurst War broke out in Bathurst when a farmer offered potatoes to some passing Wiradjuri, but since they had no concept of private property, they started to help themselves the next day. The farmer then fired on them. His hut was then approached by a large group of Wiradjuri warriors, but he talked them out of attacking. However, attacks started taking place across Bathurst, where farmers were killed and their weapons were stolen. Their buildings were burned and their animals were killed. In August, 75 men were sent to Bathurst, and they soon started to kill the Wiradjuri. After this, many of them stopped, but their leader, Dradine, continued fighting. On December 28th, he finally made peace, ending the war after around 20 British and around 100 Wiradjuri had been killed. Anyways, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you next time.